So hi, my name is Michael Hennison, and we've got Phil Dawson also online.
Hello.
And also online we have Michael Phillips and Tracy Ryan, who will be helping us out. They're part of the team, but they drew the short straws, and they'll be working just in the chat window to support anyone with their questions or helping out with any technical issues. So this is the Feedback for Learning Closing the Assessment Loop project, and this is some of our findings and some of the big ideas around the project that we wanted to share with you all today. So today we want to, in a short 45 minutes, give you a brief intro to the project and team, super short. We also wanted to recap on feedback, what we already know about feedback, the problem with feedback as we understand it today, and the conceptions of what effective feedback should be. And we want to broker to you a new definition of feedback that's both useful and, we think, challenging. And within that definition are some design challenges for us all. We also want to share some of the key findings from our large survey work, and particularly the case studies, which we think are fantastic exemplars of things that we could be doing, but also reveal some of the big issues that we need to be dealing with at a strategic level through to a design level. We also want to share with you the Feedback for Learning framework. So out of all of our work, we started coming together and realizing we needed to define what effective feedback is, the challenges around it, but particularly also think about the conditions that we need to engage with in order to ensure that this can happen across different contexts. And with that, we have 40 elaborated strategies. We won't go through all of them today, but we'll just touch on them just to give you a sense of how to engage with it. And finally, we want to close the loop with you all, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So the team, very quickly, we're very privileged to have a large team across 3 different institutions, Monash, Deakin and Melbourne. We've got some names there, which I think you might all be familiar with. These people have been working in this space for quite some time. We've also got the privilege of having David Carless on the team in terms of being a project evaluator, and he's been invaluable in helping us through some of our key thinking and workshopping of ideas. This is also a OLT project. It was funded under the original OLT funding scheme, and we would like to acknowledge the Australian Government Department of Education and Training for the funding, and saying that the views here, are not necessarily reflecting their views. And also, this is a Creative Commons license, so you're most welcome to use this video in another form later on. Okay, so the project, Feedback for Learning Closing the Assessment Loop, was really about this idea that we've got enough designs in this landscape. We have a lot of different ideas about how to do feedback, but really we don't go enough into the reasons why it's working or not working in certain circumstances. So we wanted to take a more ecological approach to understand all the different kinds of politics, labour, micro, meso, macro kinds of conditions, as well as understanding what is a really neat or smart design. So we engage in a large scale mixed methods study. We're going to talk about the survey and the case studies in a moment. We also had the privilege of having people in the team who have been writing and researching in the space for a couple of decades. And so we've been able to draw upon them to do a very good critical reflective process at every stage. And that has led us to this framework. So overall, we've had 4 phases. And to just give you a quick idea, phase 1 was really trying to identify, well, what's going on? We think that there are problems, but we thought maybe it's best for us to go out and have a look. So we did a large-scale survey of 4,500 students and 400 staff across 2 institutions in Australia. And we did some focus groups to try and get some more elaborated understandings of what we were seeing in the survey. Phase 2 is where we start engaging in these sort of these case studies, these exemplar or lighthouse case studies. We wanted to understand when it works, but what's the story behind it when it did work. And so we engaged in interviews with staff and students, and through a process of sifting and synthesizing, we ended up with these case studies, which we're going to share with you. In phase 3, we then took an abstracted view and worked with our reference group and large team to work out what do those case studies mean for us in terms of the design challenges. And finally, right now, we're doing a national roadshow. We've been around the country, and now we're doing this webinar, and we're continuing to do this work. And very soon, in about a month or so, or a few weeks, you may also see a link to a very short survey asking you if you've been able to use any of this information, or whether it has had any impact or will have an impact in your institution, because we are trying to close the loop for ourselves. So Phil.
All right. Thanks so much, Michael. And also I'd like to really acknowledge Michael's excellent leadership of this project. We wouldn't be here saying these things without Michael getting the funding, running a great project. I could talk for the rest of the time about that, and I'm not going to, but thank you. So look, we want to start off by talking about what the problem with feedback is. Here's our kind of grab from the literature of what some of these problems are. Firstly, we've got the classic one of learners complaining they don't get enough feedback. I don't know if that's been your experience, wanting more and it not happening. We've got both parties, learners and educators, describing feedback as a confronting experience. Some of my worst moments as an educator and worst moments as a student have been around feedback. We've got both parties agreeing that it's really important. We know that educators resent that they put a lot of time into feedback, and learners sometimes seem to take very little notice of it. If you go and find studies around how often students actually use feedback, you'll be in for a very sad rest of your afternoon. We know that educators typically think their feedback is more useful than learners think it is. We've got a bit of a mismatch between what one party in it thinks and what the other party thinks. And also that, well, feedback is typically telling and diagnostic in flavour, often without a focus on improvement, often without a focus on what's next? What can I do to make this better? And give me a chance to show you. So that's sort of our take on the problem with feedback from the literature. I'm going to ask Michael to click the button now, please. And I'm going to do that throughout because of technical reasons. So this is sort of the bad old days of feedback. We load up the feedback cannon and we shoot it, and well, our job's kind of done and we feel good about that. We've done our part. Or do we? Is that kind of enough? Throughout, you're going to see some great Creative Commons licensed cartoons there by Simon Kneebone, a political cartoonist. My tip to you, if you ever get a big grant, budget in for a cartoonist. It's been some of the best money we've spent. Next slide, please. So here's another sort of classic feedback emotional experience, the feedback sandwich. You tell them something nice, you unload the criticism, and then you tell them something nice to kind of patch them up at the end. Although this is kind of a popular feedback design that's promoted a lot, there's some real critique of it in the literature, that people discard that nice bread and zoom in on the criticism in the middle. Students have become wise to the ritual of the feedback sandwich. Again, we could talk for the rest of the time about the issues with the feedback sandwich. I'd love to engage with you in a debate in it, but this is not what we're thinking of when we think of a great sophisticated feedback design, but it's somewhat commonplace. Next one. Now, we do know that feedback is really powerful, or it can be really powerful. Here's a real classic paper on feedback. It's John Hattie's Black Box of Tertiary Assessment and Impending Revolution. In that paper, Hattie finds a very large effect size for feedback from synthesising together many studies. And Hattie also argues that not only is feedback really powerful on its own, but feedback's probably the mechanism behind a lot of other really powerful educational interventions. So feedback can be very powerful. Now, we have come up with a definition of what we think of as effective feedback that we'd like to share with you. I'm going to put it to you, we're going to tear it apart a bit, and then we're going to present it again and talk about some of the challenges in it. So the first part of our definition is that feedback is a process in which learners make sense of information about their performance and use it to enhance the quality of their work or learning strategies. I'll just let that sit for like 10 seconds or something before I use ESP for Michael to click on. Okay, so if we take that sort of definition, we then look at that stack of uncollected essays in someone's office. That's not my office. I've had something pretty similar to that before. It was my wasted weekend. It was not feedback. The statement, I left feedback on their final essays, which they never collected, is incompatible with that sort of understanding of feedback, because that sort of definition of feedback says feedback's a process learners do. Learners have done nothing with that. You've just tragically lost time from other more useful pursuits. There's dangling data, there's hopefully useful information in there, but there's no feedback. So this suggests that we need to look at it from another point of view. We'll go to one other point of view. Here's a thermostat. So we in education took the word feedback from other fields. We took it from biology. We took it from engineering. In my home discipline of computer science, we have a different understanding of feedback as well. But common to a lot of these sort of STEM type understandings of feedback is that feedback is not the input, feedback is the process. So in the room that I'm in, there's a thermostat. It's got sensors that are giving it information about the temperature of the room. That thermostat's job is to keep the temperature at a certain level. The thermostat is told it's too cold. The thermostat then sends a request to a heat pump to heat up the room. The thermostat is monitoring and trying to track any change, and when it sees the change, it sends another signal saying, turn the heat pump off. In the places that we've taken the word feedback from, there is this sort of long-standing understanding that feedback is a process where inputs lead to change, and feedback is not just the input. Next slide. So feedback is more akin to this sort of thing than it is to the stack of uncollected essays. Here we've got something that involves a lot of loops. It's iterative, there's impacts, there's change, and there's a student in charge of the whole thing who's engaged in many cycles, getting better and leaping off to the next thing. Next slide. So just zooming back to this definition, there's a bunch of sort of challenges inherent in a process-centric definition like this. Our definition that feedback is a process in which learners make sense of information about their performance and use it to enhance the quality of their work or learning strategies. In the next slide, we've sort of picked out some of these things that are kind of thorny, challenging things about our definition of feedback that we've drawn from the literature and experts. Feedback as a process can be a hard one to get your head around. I'd like you to imagine you're here with me in cultured Melbourne, where we have the degustation. The degustation metaphor worked in some places in Australia, but not in others. So bear with me. But imagine you are kind of planning this fantastic degustation meal for somebody. And you give the job to my 5-year-old son and you say, here are the best ingredients, or here's fantastic feedback comments. My 5-year-old son will make a very bad degustation because the best ingredients, he's just not going to think about people's appetite. He's not going to think about the sequencing of courses. He's not going to think about nutrition or allergies. Bringing this into the feedback world, feedback's more than the comments, the ingredients. Those are very, very important. You can't do it without great ingredients. But you've got to be thinking about people's appetite. What do they want? What do they need? You've got to be thinking about the sequencing of courses. How am I connecting different dishes in this degustation or different learning activities and information about performance together? You've got to think about people's nutrition. What people want from you in feedback is not always what they need. And you've got to think about people's allergies. People have had some of their worst educational experiences in the form of feedback. They may have particular needs that we need to tailor things to. This challenge in our definition that feedback is a process requires us to move beyond writing better feedback comments to designing better feedback processes. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the process view in the next. So I'm sure we've had something like this before. You know, you present the stuff and you say, engage with this feedback. And there's this sort of response. Well, what's in it for us? Why would I even engage with this? We tell students the same thing over and over again and they don't act on it. For me, that's been some of my more frustrating educational experiences. Next one. To try and get into this, I'd like to talk about how our understandings of feedback designs have evolved over the past few decades. And here I'm referring to a really great paper by Bowden-Molloy. This is one of the most impactful papers on feedback that's been written. It's in Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education. If you read one paper on feedback, make it this one. And hopefully someone who knows the paper I'm talking about might chuck it in the chat. And if you're watching this afterwards, if you Google Bowden-Molloy feedback, that's what you get. So in the bad old days, that Bowden-Molloy call feedback mark 0, feedback was hopefully useful information. Feedback was given or done to receivers. You see the statement there, the professor gave feedback to the student. One person's active in this and one person's kind of passive. And feedback was provided on completion of work, just at the time that people don't exactly need it for this piece of work. Sure, they might intuit that they should use it for the next task, but you're giving them feedback on this thing when they can't improve this thing anymore. In the feedback mark 0, mark 1, mark 2 world that I'm going to talk about here, I would regard feedback mark 0 as not acceptable in Australian higher education. Feedback mark 1 is kind of where we're at as sort of the minimum standard. This mark 1, if you're not doing some of these things, you're probably getting kind of annoyed students. So we're now in this feedback mark 1 sort of world of more than hopefully useful information. We're looking for effect. We're not just blasting the feedback cannon. We're looking to see, have students improved based on the information that they were given. It's still given or done to, or just back one, Michael, it's still given or done to receivers, but it's sequenced to require improvement. So that idea of connected tasks, and it's given in time to allow for improved work. So yeah, on to the next one. This sort of design, I think, is quite common in Australian higher ed. We have activity 1, students get comments on it. They do activity 2, comments, activity 3. So there's a connection there. Feedback's in the middle, the students hopefully acting on it between tasks. Next slide. And this is the slightly more sophisticated feedback mark 1 version. So in this one, you've got, as time goes on, the level of challenge with respect to a learning outcome increases. And you've got the idea of sort of overlapping tasks, overlapping of learning outcomes. If you've ever set an annotated bibliography and then an essay plan and then an essay as your 3 assessment tasks, and you've given students comments that they can improve on from one to the next, you're doing this sort of design. On to the next one. So that's where we are as far as the sort of minimum acceptable standard. Where we'd like to be, so where we hope to move in the coming years, is to feedback mark 2. Feedback mark 2 takes all the good bits of feedback mark 1, especially looking for an effect, and it adds in a few things. So it adds in feedback dialogues, that feedback is not a one-way transmission, that feedback might involve some back and forth conversation. It's participatory and agentic. So it's not the professor did feedback to the student. It's the student doing feedback. It's the student having some agency in this. seeking out information themselves. It's involving other people, not just the expert. It might involve peers. In some of our work, I've seen the use of social media. In our survey, a lot of students reported that their parents were involved in feedback. Feedback Mark II acknowledges this sort of stuff and tries to bring it into this feedback design. And it involves the development of evaluative judgment. Now, when we say that, evaluative judgment is your understanding of what quality looks like and your ability to make decisions about the quality of the work of yourself and other people. On to the next one. So here's sort of a bit of an example of what Feedback Mark II might look like. So in Feedback Mark II, we commonly begin with an orientation to the standards of work and to the purpose of feedback. So often, I don't know about you, but one of the key challenges in assessment is my students not knowing, what does a good one of these look like? What do I have to do to get a HD? Can you show us what one of these looks like? Commonly in a Feedback Mark II design, you'll begin with, say, showing students exemplars of a really good one of these and getting them to understand how the standards are illustrated in that. There's also orientation to the purpose of feedback. In our survey, we've actually found students hold reasonably sophisticated views of feedback, but there are still people walking around with really negative experiences. They think your feedback comments are designed to tear them apart. They're not. That's not what you're trying to do. But a conversation about what feedback's for is a common part of Feedback Mark II. So you're then starting students in an activity. Now, while they're doing this, they're judging work. They might be judging their own work. So say if you've got a rubric, they might be looking at the rubric and looking at their own work. And as they go, trying to see how aspects of quality are represented in the work. When the learners are giving their work to somebody else, they're asking for specific feedback. I don't know about you, but when my colleagues ask me to give them feedback on their draft paper or something, the first question I ask is, well, what do you want? What specifically do you want to know about this work? I'm happy to give you comments on your draft, but are you after proofreading, spelling and grammar? Are you after high concept, comments on the method? What do you want? So in Feedback Mark II, learners are really making those specific feedback requests. Then there's others judging the work. Might be experts, might be peers, might be a computer system if you're working in an online multiple choice question environment or something. Then there's a comparison of judgments. Now, say when I teach with rubrics, I give students the rubric at the start of the semester. When students submit their work to me, they fill out a self-assessed copy of the rubric. I mark another copy of the rubric, and I give them detailed feedback comments where our judgment differs. I don't tell them, you're bad for this reason, and you're bad for that reason. To me, that's a bit of a waste of my time. I tell them, hey, it's interesting. You think against this criterion you didn't do that well, but actually you did. And here's why I think our judgments are different. Or the reverse. You actually have an overinflated sense of your achievement for that criterion. Here's why it wasn't up to that standard. So there's that idea of comparing judgments. Learners also need to be doing this. Learners need to be looking at your judgment and their judgment and interrogating those differences. Because at the end of the day, that's what we do as professionals. We get feedback from all sorts of sources. We have to turn that into action. And then there's planning for improved work. And then the second activity, which addresses some of the same outcomes, and students are expected to perform them at a higher standard. So on to the next one, Michael. Okay, so that's sort of our feedback masterclass in however many minutes I've been. I guess the key messages are that feedback can be really powerful, but sadly it's kind of rarely powerful. We haven't gone on at you about the levels of dissatisfaction of students in feedback, though I really encourage you to have a look at Michael's piece in The Conversation from this week, which does talk about student dissatisfaction in feedback. So it can be powerful, it rarely is. A core thing that I want you to take and share with the world is that feedback's not an input, it's a process. And we need to focus on the design of that process. And that we need to judge feedback in terms of the outcomes. Fantastic feedback comments are nothing if they don't lead to outcomes. Thanks. Over to you, Michael.
Fantastic. Thanks, Phil. And while I get everything set up, fantastic. Okay, so what we thought we might do after this really quick masterclass in feedback of where we've been and where we're hoping to go with the definition that we're working with, I thought we would spend a little bit of time just looking at some of the data coming out of the survey and then into the case studies and then finish off with talking about the framework. There is so much information in this project that we can't cover all of it in this webinar. What we hope to do is sensitize you to some of the big issues and encourage you to get onto the website where we have videos embedded and discussions of all these different kinds of issues. So just quickly, Phil mentioned that there was a piece in the conversation this week, and this is an infographic drawn from that based on our survey data. And while there's a lot of red, I think the important thing is to say that in our work, most students are satisfied or feeling that the feedback is doing a good job. However, there's so much room for improvement. We see some interesting trends, such as over the years across a degree program, so across a bachelor's program, students seem to have a negative trend, so slightly being less satisfied or feeling that it's less useful as they progress through their degree. There are a number of students who feel that the feedback is discouraging. We know that an emotional response can set students up to react in a certain kind of way or disregard feedback so we have to be careful of these kinds of things. One of the interesting things that we found was that there is a worryingly small proportion of staff who are saying themselves that they specifically go and try and connect one assessment piece to the next so that the feedback makes this loop, that it connects the two parts of the learning. So when we take all that into account, we can say that, well, actually, you know what? I was surprised that the feedback is being received well by students, that 94% of the students said they really wanted the feedback, and 76% said that they were going to act upon or have already acted upon that feedback. So that's a higher percentage than I was sort of guessing from my own practice. But at the same time, there are these worrying trends. So what we then went from that surveying and the focus groups, we started trying to identify within the two institutions some specific exemplars of where feedback seemed to be working really well, because we wanted to understand why. Not just what they did, but also why. And so these cases that we've come up with, we think are fantastic exemplars of effective feedback. So they'll tell you all about the background and exactly what they did and why they did it, but particularly about the kinds of underlying conditions or traditions, the politics, the economics that led to this effective example. And we think that this is something that we really need to be paying attention. Instead of trying to transplant one idea from here to the next without thinking of all of these or planning for all of these underlying conditions and therefore seeing it fall over, we need to be more sensitive to this. So in terms of the cases, there are 7 cases that we ended up working up, and they range across degree programs and disciplines. They're looking at different kinds of elements, whether it is personalizing the feedback or feedback in the classroom itself, authentic through social media. So here are the 7 titles, and I've just highlighted a few of the key words. So if you are interested in a really large at-scale case, then I think you'll find that almost all of our cases are at scale. And they're showing ways in which we can do some interesting, innovative feedback processes that we might otherwise assume is way too resource intensive and unsustainable. Also, we can find some really interesting strategies in here. So for instance, the authentic feedback through social media is outsourcing some of that feedback process by getting students to engage with the wider community and then helping them to be able to evaluate that information that they're receiving. So I encourage you to get onto the feedbackforlearning.org website and to explore these cases. Each case has a number of videos and goes into detail, and it has a summary. It goes through the case description, quite detailed, and particularly it says why it works. There's some key design issues, but also enablers and challenges, and links to the literature in case you want to engage in this in a scholarly fashion, and also come to try and understand, as we were, some of the issues that were going on from the literature. We also have some short advice to the educators, institutions, and some resources and links for you to keep pursuing. So these are very useful if you want to share them with your colleagues, if you're in an education design position, for instance, or to explore for yourself. Now, in this particular case, for instance, case study 2, personalised feedback at scale, this is a really interesting case as an example. In this particular case, this particular subject has about 1,500 learners, so 1,500 learners, and about 30 educators employed to work with the tutorials and the seminars. In this particular case study, we talk about how there are 3 assessment pieces, 3 journal entries, and how they're closely aligned. This is one of the design features. They're closely aligned so that the performative information, so this feedback, okay, the feedback process, the information that students are receiving and they're trying to come to understand and act upon, is directly related to the next journal entry. And so that's a key design element that we need to be looking. If you're not doing that straight away, I think you could be saying that maybe already all of your attempts towards effective feedback are being hampered because there's no way for someone to act upon that information. And another aspect of this was that the feedback was moderated. So the information that is being transmitted by the educator to the student, saying, you know, where they're working well, what do they need to be working on, what kinds of key issues, that information was moderated by the senior staff in this unit. So it wasn't left, so sessional staff members, all those 30 different staff members weren't left to their own devices. What they produced was then moderated, and so they got information about how well they were providing information to their students. And this is a really important aspect of the design. This is why it worked, because there was someone trying to say, hey, you know, you should be doing more of this or doing a little bit less of that, or have you thought of including this in the information you provide? Another aspect of this case was its personalisation, and it personalised in 2 different ways that we thought were particularly important. One was that it was an audio recording, and so we know through our research and through the literature that an audio or video recording seems to have a larger impact, and is reported by the students to have been felt more personal, so that someone is actually reaching out to them. And that has a potential impact on how they're going to receive it and act upon it and be motivated by it. But also, these 3 assessment pieces were assessed and the feedback was engaged with by the same educator. So a student had a continuity or a continuous experience with the same educator. The educator could understand that particular student and their progression across the 3 assessment pieces. So for some people in small units, this might not be a concern, but for large units, or subjects, this is a particular issue that we think is really important and something that needs to be planned for. So we encourage you to go into these cases and explore them for the ideas that they have, but also the challenges to our own systems and processes and policies, and we can sort of work together to try and make a change. So by looking at those cases and analysing them within the case and across cases, and then workshopping them with our reference group and expert team, we started to come up with 12 particularly key conditions that seem to be present in multiple cases. Now, these conditions that we're seeing are not something that we're saying that you must have it in order for feedback to be effective. But in these 7 case studies of effective feedback, these 12 conditions that we have synthesized were present and were significant. And so we thought they were worthwhile to represent to you and say, this is something that maybe we need to be thinking about in your example, in your particular context. And we clustered these into 3 key themes, mostly as handles for us to be able to grapple with them. And those 3 themes are capacity, designs, and culture. Altogether, the framework is made up by our definition because we needed a guiding, a shining light or a direction in which to go. So the definition really is our touch point. The definition, as Phil explained, has 7 design challenges within it. But then part of the framework is also these 12 conditions organized into these 3 categories. And they are supported by 40 strategies or examples that we have drawn from the case studies to show how these 12 conditions have been met in the various case studies. So just going through quickly, the 3 categories, capacity for feedback. Each of these 3 have just nicely worked out to have 4 conditions each. We didn't really plan it that way. And some of these are really large, almost seemingly motherhood statements. But remember, underneath these are these elaborated case studies with the strategies of how these were engaged with. And we'll look a little bit closer at them in a moment. So under the capacity for feedback, the first one is learners and educators understand and value the feedback. And it's important to include that point of valuing the feedback. And when we say feedback, we're also talking about our definition. This idea that the whole point of feedback is it's a process and it has something to do with impact, with change. It's not just giving information. When we saw in these cases that they were valuing and understanding, even if they didn't use our definition, but they understood the whole point of feedback is to have an impact, and they went searching to see whether that impact was occurring. You know, it was writ large in a number of our cases, and so it became part of one of our conditions. So number 2 is learners are active in the feedback process. It's fairly obvious. Educators seek and use evidence to plan and judge effectiveness. So this is interesting that we saw that a sustained approach and an evolving approach to effective feedback was when the educators were constantly restless. They were evaluatively restless. They kept wanting to check through the literature, to their own data sources, their own student surveys, and try to keep developing, always tweaking. We can never rest. Number 4 is learners and educators have access to appropriate space and technology. So if you go into number 4, you'll sort of explore a number of different ways, both digital technologies as being a useful support or resource, but also how the space, the physical space and the virtual spaces were supporting effective feedback practices. The second category is designs for feedback, and this is where we might find some things that we often talk about when we're talking about feedback and effective feedback, and that's things like it needs to be personalised or tailored. There should be a variety of sources and modes, you know, whether it's working towards a learner preference or even the educator preference, or indeed to the particular task or learning goals, that sometimes the mode, the modality of you doing it, whether it's through audio or video or through text, may be more effective. And also that the learning outcomes of multiple tasks are aligned. So you have this alignment across tasks. We also saw that across these cases that the culture for feedback was very important, that it needed to be valued and visible, a visible enterprise at all levels, whether it's policy within a unit and the moderation processes that are going on, such as the one that I talked about with case study 2, through to policies around feedback. Often feedback is buried in a policy around assessment, but what we're hoping to convey to you is that feedback is not the same as assessment. Sure, there are practices that touch, but feedback has this extra process in it, an extra goal of impact, and not just justifying a grade or demonstrating a grade. We also understand that there's a need to ensure consistency and quality, and that leaders and educators, the continuity of these people were very important. For change to occur and for a feedback practice to develop over time, this kind of continuity was essential. And it can happen at all levels, from right up managers, school managers, right down to the tutors, creating a continuity or a continuous experience for the learners. Also, the educators need to have the flexibility to deploy resources to best effect. We often hear the story of, and we all experience it, of the lack of time. And we heard this message a lot. But really the way that we started to dig down and saying, well, how did these 7 excellent case studies work around this key issue, which they were experiencing as well? You know, they weren't told that here is a bunch of money that no one else ever gets, and you can go and spend it on extra time to engage in feedback processes. They found interesting workarounds or work through the system of redistributing resources and rethinking where feedback fits into the grand scheme of things, and often rethinking feedback as part of the teaching process. And by doing that, they were able to sort of engage in a sustainable process. So those are the 12 conditions, and each of those have quite a lot of detail. So here's an example of one. So again, there's videos, and from the website, you can see the pull-down menu. It goes straight into this framework. So the second condition you might remember is that learners are active in the feedback process. And really this is talking about the idea that learners need to, at the end of the day, be able to be independent and to be able to evaluate their own performance. But we need to be able to support that. It doesn't just happen. So there are some ways to do it. So one, for instance, so each of these strategies are then elaborated through the case studies. In the case studies, there are a number of different ways of doing it. One, for instance, is to encourage learners to seek feedback from different sources other than the educator. It becomes more sustainable then, but it also allows them the opportunity to try and evaluate the worth of that particular information, that performance information they're receiving. And if that's built into your assessment regime or in your teaching program, then you could help them in that evaluative process. And eventually, over time, we're going to be developing far more independent learners. So this is the problem. We have gone in and surveyed 4,500 students and 400 staff. We've done focus groups. We've gone to these 7 case studies and talked to staff and students. We've collected documents. We've met and spent innumerable hours working through these conditions and thinking through what these strategies are. So we encourage you to go to the website to explore those strategies. These motherhood statements don't stand by themselves. The problem is, of course, as I said before, that we can't really expect to take one idea here and transplant it over there without carefully orchestrating or tweaking or tailoring it. So while this is what feedback looks like to us in these 7 cases and across this large survey, it's only really from this particular perspective. And so what we do encourage you is to explore and be critical of the resources that we offer, and certainly feed back to us what you see is missing or what is particularly important. And that's something that we're hoping to do in a short survey that's going to come out to everybody in the next few weeks. And we hope to find out more through that process of where we're going right and where we're going wrong, and what we can do to improve these resources. So the next steps for us is disseminating our findings more broadly. We're going to be exploring more of the strategies, particularly in relation to those design challenges around the feedback definition. We're going to be working with our partners, and some of them are you, both nationally and internationally, to keep developing these ideas and resources. And we're going to be monitoring the impact, trying to close that loop to see the impact. And the next steps for you, well, we'd like to challenge you all to consider, does any of this information have an impact upon you? Whether it's the masterclass on feedback and the understandings of where we've been and where we hope to go with feedback, the challenges or the cases, or indeed the framework and the conditions. What will you do to affect change in your department, and how can this project develop any further resources that might support you? This PowerPoint, the slides, the cartoons, this recording are all going to be on our website for you to be able to use and share with your colleagues, including this PowerPoint along with speaker notes if you want to present a component of this to your own colleagues as well. Okay, we've just reaching our time now, our 45 minutes, and I'd like to thank you all for attending. We're going to be online for another 15 minutes to respond to any questions. Because we've got over 120 attendees, we can't open the microphone up to everybody, but we're hopefully going to be able to get a few questions through the chat window. Thank you again for attending, and please do look at our website for extra resources.